Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are living on this fast forward, turbulent, confusing planet and in the information environment we're all immersed in, living so much of our lives online these days. I'm Andy Revkin. I'm at the Earth Institute at Columbia University building a new initiative on communication and sustainability. And the big question is, how do you make information matter? We would all like the world to be the way we hope it can be. But our new information environment is a noisy, fractious, emergent place where all the norms that we grew up with, those of us who grew up mostly in the 20th century, are still freaking out about how it works. You have digital natives who are growing up, the young people in this environment, who have a little more idea, but they're still captured by these platforms that confuse and can bathe you in reinforcing your positions, and they're designed actually to do that and also to aggravate you because that's what keeps you into your attention. So I was really excited when I saw that the World Health Organization, which has been focused on reducing the health ailments that are still such a huge problem on this planet, particularly infectious disease, but also all the other questions we face, it started to focus on the information environment and how it is impeding rational approaches to risk reduction on a planet with so many layers of risk right now, and not even including climate, which I've spent 30 years writing about. So today it's a pleasure to have Tim Nguyen here. Tim, I want to make sure I pronounce your last name right. How do you say it? Whoop.
Well, it depends on which language, but I think in the US they usually say Nguyen.
Nguyen,
Yeah.
who is with the World Health Organization, WHO, and is spearheading this initiative to harness all the intelligence and scholarship and experience of public health communication and other communication arenas to essentially mature a field you're calling infodemiology. And also I have with me Claire Wardle, who's the U.S. Rep, the director for First Draft News, which is a great platform you'll learn more about in a couple of minutes that's helping reporters and the public to more generally find ways to convey reality, again, amid this noisy environment. And I want to start by just showing a little brief video that the WHO produced recently that gets at this. Hopefully I've got the sound set up correctly. Do you hear it? Oh, you don't? Okay. It should be there. Oh, we'll get back to that in a second. Tim, let's start with you and this basic question. When you think about the information environment and public health, what is the problem right now as you define it?
Oh, well, thank you, Andy, for inviting us, on this talk and, giving perspective on what we see and call infodemic. I think the challenge for us is, this is a global event. And through this global event, all people are somehow connected and share the common problem and share their thoughts about the issue. And since we are now also, in such an interconnected way, connected with everybody, through different platforms, we share information and we consume information. And there's this feeling that there's just too much out there for many people to make sense. And look to the left or look to the right where this information is coming from, and then make a healthy choice, a healthy decision about what protective measures they can take, to protect themselves and their families. And being able to make that decision, you need to be pointed to the right information, and you need to understand to distinguish the kind of information that are not correct or might lead to other actions, that be harmful to you. And this is, something we see exacerbated in this current situation of a pandemic. And this is where, we try to come, with the right approaches to understand this and then provide the right healthy information to individual people.
And one thing I've learned, again, I mentioned a minute ago, I've been a journalist for 35 years now, and basically everything I've covered has been risk. It's been risk or response, earthquakes, climate change, 9/11. And my whole approach was me telling the audience something. And it took me 20 years of that before I started talking to social scientists. Like I was writing about all these geophysical things and biological things, and I talked to the social scientists. And Claire, you can dive in on this now. And it was a real OMG moment for me. Literally, in 2006, I was writing a piece on why everybody's so freaked out about global warming. Fighting and loud, and so that was before Twitter was even a big deal, and Twitter emerged around that time. And a social scientist, Helen Ingram at UC Irvine, said to me, well, in the context of voting, people vote on things that are soon, salient, and certain. And I'm thinking about that in the context of climate. I'm going, okay. And then I talked to people who study what they call cultural cognition, which is that our culture mediates, it's like wearing a pair of glasses that give you a completely different perception and reaction to what you're seeing. And I thought, okay, this is problematic as a journalist. So should I spend the next 20 years writing really cool award-winning stories on climate change that I know really don't change that landscape? So Claire, you obviously have been dug in on that end of things in a much more deeper way than I have. So when you think about the environment we're living in, the information environment around this pandemic, what are the core ideas that came to you? And when did you become focused on that full landscape of how information changes people versus the sort of storytelling part?
Yeah, so I actually am academic by training. I did my PhD back in the day at Penn. I came from the UK, came over to the US to do my PhD, and then I went back to Europe to be a professor, and I thought that's what I was going to do. And after 5 years, I felt increasingly frustrated that the things I was researching and writing about weren't really hitting the people that I really wanted to affect. So I ended up leaving in 2009 and started working with the BBC, training journalists on how to make sense of this user-generated content that was coming from the public, which made journalists feel very uncomfortable, which is, well, I'm the person with all the knowledge. How can these people help me, and how do I verify that information? But to your point, Andy, the challenge for those of us who come from a kind of a research, journalistic, fact-checking background is we like to think people have a rational relationship to information, and more facts is a good thing. And of course it is, and we need to have we need to have an accurate record. It's absolutely imperative that people understand where they can get the facts. But I think what we've missed is that humans have an emotional relationship to information. And it doesn't matter how educated you are, we are all susceptible to information that reinforces our existing worldview. And we are drawn to that kind of information because it makes us feel something. And in the world that I spend my time, which is unfortunately some of the darker areas of the internet, you see that those people who are trying to push false and misleading information understand that. They understand memes, they understand emotion, they understand fear. And those of us who are trying to push quality information, we're full of, well, we just need more words. We need another 87-page PDF. We need another explainer. And that's going to save us. And I think that's the kind of asymmetrical landscape that unfortunately we're working on. But how do we ensure that we put science at the core of compelling content that actually makes people feel something? And, I think one thing I'll say is like the flatten the curve diagram should win a Pulitzer. Like in that diagram, we actually made sense of a really complex idea. And I think that's where we need to get to. How can we think about design, diagrams, visuals, and move slightly away from text, which I think those of us who come from this discipline are disproportionately drawn to.
Well, may I just build on this, Andy? I think I cannot stress more what Claire just said. This concept of infodemic management is not something born out of thin air. I think WHO in many health emergencies, have a response pillar that we call risk communication and community engagement. And where we try to put communities that are affected at the center and see how we can support them to transpose those messages to the people that are listening to them. So in, let's say, example, the Ebola outbreak in DRC, going to villages, talking to village chiefs, talking to religious leaders, that then they can amplify these key messages. It has been always, a key concept of WHO response in emergencies and communicating risk and social behavior changes in the communities. What comes on top now is that we have new communities. That is not the geographical boundaries of where people live together, but they meet in different forums, physically and non-physically. So, you have, your Facebook group, and I'm in a Facebook group of people sharing same interests, and there is certain exchange. I never met these people, right? But no, this is a community where we share same values. But what I hear there is then also transposed to my physical world, where I really meet people. And this is this exchange of physical or non-physical world that is really important to understand. We have to go away from a top-down approach of creating a guidance document and expect everybody to read and understand it. We transition over to a process of infographics or breaking down the science into something that is more digestible to lay people, but also what we say now, shareable. We want people to share good advice, but it's not that we can send them a PDF link with 80 pages of recommendations, but it needs to be distilled in a way that people intuitively can see what are the key behavioral change measures that I can adapt in my daily life. But then I can also share with my families, because I can trust this source that they then can help share and communicate with others.
Right. And that, you got at a key point too, and Claire mentioned the possibility of a Pulitzer for the flatten the curve diagram. What's been so interesting to me there is that often it's lay communicators who've been leading the way. Thomas Pueo, who probably wrote and illustrated the most effective document on the flatten the curve idea back in March with millions and millions and millions of views. He's not a journalist. I had him on this webcast recently, and it was so interesting to see. There's a long history to that. Parts of that go back to the 1918 flu, some diagrams. And so I guess that's one thing, circling back to what WHO is working on with this interdisciplinary workshop, is the old players are no longer, the best ideas aren't going to come from a newsroom necessarily, or from even a scholar. So what does that mashup look like? And Claire, both of you, if you could get at that, maybe Tim, you could get at how you organize this meeting and what the hope is for that bubbling process. And then Claire.
Thank you. I think what we're trying to bring into this conference is, scholars and scientists from different fields, really have a multidisciplinary approach and looking at the same problem. Because, the way we approach is first, internally in WHO, I work with different heads that work in different departments, from digital health, from immunization, from health systems. So they already bring a different perspective on the challenge. But if you add then also scholars who have different school of thoughts, who have different methods developed for their science and looking at the same problem. And the way we approach and found this excellent research at the conference is we looked into the publication of the last 3 years about certain key terms we put in, and what we realize is that this research comes really from different fields, from physics, from mathematics, from social science, from media journalism, and I think we counted now 14 different disciplines we invited to this conference, just to give us ideas and a process that we put in place, that this ideation can come and is valued, that somebody can have a different perspective on a problem, but contributing to the solution of a problem. The key challenge for us and for the organizer team is to bring this all together now and see, how can we make sense of all the good sense to provide, a research framework that brings, us forward. I think one of the key elements we already see as the conference is ongoing is that we need to have a common taxonomy when we talk about an issue. Let's take, example, social listening. There was a big debate the other day on one of the group, what is social listening? And, if you talk to one person, it's a different concept than to another. And I think this is already where we can only advance this field once we have a common taxonomy and the way of talking to each other. And this is one of the goals we try to achieve with this conference. Over.
No, and I was just going to pick up exactly this point about it's peer-to-peer. The reason that people are drawn to the internet is that you can always find communities that support your ideas. And it's still very important that we have strong gatekeepers, whether that's health authorities or journalists. But quite rightly, people increasingly are kind of questioning, and we are seeing non-traditional sources rising up and writing posts that are getting lots of traffic. But that's hard for an audience member. Do I believe that Medium post that seems to be really, really good, or this Medium post that's on the same thing? But apparently people are now telling me that it's crazy and I shouldn't trust it. So this question of how do we, somebody's got a thunderstorm.
Yeah, pretty intense. The lights just flickered too, so there's a chance that this may get cut off. I'll just
Wow.
let everybody know.
But I was really drawn by exactly what Tim was saying, which is, in the field, understanding how communities work and understanding who within a community is a gatekeeper. Maybe it's a faith leader, maybe it's the village elder, maybe it's the aunties and uncles, and what does that look like in a WhatsApp community? And how can we build out those networks? Because, when, again, we've seen disinformation actors in the past, particularly around elections, they might have spent 4 years building up networks of WhatsApp groups that they could push out poor quality information. But on the journalism side, journalists were like, well, I'm not going to create a network of WhatsApp groups. That's activism. That's not journalism. So again, who's doing what and who's winning in these spaces? And I'd say, working with organizations that have worked in the field for a long time and taking what they've learned in the offline space and say, well, which bits of this actually can we take to the online space and what bits can't we? And I think we're still quite early to that, and it's not one for one. But I certainly would argue, going back to your social listening part, Tim, I hear a lot of people say, we just need dashboards to listen to what people are talking about. Well, unfortunately, in the last 2 years, there's been a chilling effect on speech. And increasingly, you see people move into closed Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups. They are worried about posting their thoughts online. So this social listening idea is actually increasingly difficult to do. And it's going back to people having conversations with smaller groups of people that they trust. And that is good in one way, but it's very difficult for us to know what rumors are spreading and therefore how to respond to those rumors. So again, just as I feel like the world catches up with what's happening, unfortunately, there's a lot of academic research coming out right now about the 2016 election. We're 4 months out of the 2020 election, and we're like kind of battling tactics that actually have now evolved. And that's a constant problem with this field.
Well, yeah, anyone who thinks this is just limited to this issue or to public health or to climate is missing that big picture. And Tim, or one of you did articulate that. It was Claire talking about the dark corners of the internet. There's such knowledge and awareness there, as there is even in conventional programmers. There's a group called climateaction.tech, so it's climateaction.tech, with Tristan Harris and others they've been trying to develop a code of ethics for programmers, the people at Snapchat and elsewhere, to just look at their practices and addiction and engagement for pulling us in but not doing anything, taking us down instead of up, and find new ways forward. That community seems so, the knowledge level in those who are either in the dark arts or just designing systems that are commercially successful are so far ahead of those of us focused on the arena of sustainability or resilience or public health. It seems like we're just scrambling up a hill. So Tim, I don't know if you feel, and again, for you, this predates the current pandemic. I heard such interesting stories about the learning during Ebola, on even the color of the bags you put the bodies in mattering. So much of that's about listening. But are we really scrambling up a landslide as it's still unfolding, or is there hope here?
Well, I'm always hopeful. And I think it's important that, public health and health, is now putting more attention to this whole new phenomenon of social, digital, and so on listening. But I think, and this is where I'm hopeful is, that the bad players in this area, that do the disinformation or, is a minority. But there are still a lot of people that are goodwill, but are not well informed. And I think, we should not only put our efforts into fighting mis and disinformation, but it's more about promoting good health action and empowering individual and communities to understand.
Right.
And I think one of Claire's messages I took from her presentation the other day was clearly, it's more teach people to recognize that this is bad information or this is misinformation. And I think this is the strategy, one of the key strategies we must follow is about community empowerment and building resilience to misinformation. It's not telling people this is wrong, but, bringing them to a state that they recognize it's wrong and, dispute, and then also maybe can call out or, as Claire always says, talk to their uncle privately to make them aware about the issue.
So Claire, in your toolbox at First Draft and in other tools and organizations and activities you've seen online, how much of it is about attitude, meaning you have to sort of stop and think. It's not just the tool. Like Snopes is a tool. It's there. If you care what's real or not. It's pretty easy actually right now to still find out what's real or not. But the motivation factor you both seem to be getting at, it seems it's like harder to get your hands around that, and how do you build that as opposed to the set of widgets?
Yeah, and I think, there's some great media literacy curricula out there, and there's some great work that's being done. But I worry sometimes there's a sense of we have to wait for the falsehood to circulate, and then our brains have to be like, oh, I wonder if this is true or not. Let me go to my checklist and go through a number of steps. And that's all well and good. But the truth is, when we're sitting on this and it's like the 8th hour of doom scrolling, unfortunately, all of us, again, it doesn't matter how educated you are, it doesn't matter whether you're left or right, we're all susceptible to these messages if they, give us a visceral reaction, if it makes us scared, if it makes us angry, if it makes us want to impulse buy. Like that stuff means that it doesn't matter how much media literacy training you've had, you are much less likely to even stop to check. And to your point, Andy, a lot of the way the platforms are designed is that it's so frictionless. Like it's so easy to reshare or to like or nothing helps you slow down and let your brain engage. So we talk a lot about trying to teach people to recognize that they're having an emotional reaction to something and to have that moment to say, oh, hang on, my heart rate has sped up, or I really want to share this right now because I want to prove that I'm right. And that I think we need to do more to educate the public about that emotional response, to say in that moment, stop and think. Like I've been trained that if I eat 6 cookies immediately, I'm going to want that 7th because my brain hasn't caught up with my tummy to say I don't need that 7th. So I hear my mum in my head being like, Claire, your eyes have not caught up with your tummy. And so I was trained in that way. And that's, I think, what we need to do with information is to say we cannot be critical when we have that emotional reaction, and that the most effective misinformation has been designed by bad actors to create this response in you, and that's what you need to be aware of. And I think in a lot of the media literacy conversations, it's like, make sure you check Wikipedia, make sure you do a reverse image search, and that's fine. But I've been saying this quite a lot, but the first week of the pandemic, I was locked down in my studio, living alone, scared, wondering if I'd ever get back to Europe to see my family. And I got one of those text messages that said there was going to be a lockdown, go to the shops immediately. And I sent it to 2 people I care about in the city. And of course, the next morning I woke up and I was like, oh my God, I'm meant to be the lady who knows all of this stuff. But in that moment, I was scared and I was unable to do the checks because the person who forwarded it to me said, this is from a credible source, and I trusted that person. So that's how this stuff interplays. It's all about emotion, trust networks, and it's harder than we think. Well, I think you're on mute, Andy.
I'm trying to mute the thunder. It's a pretty big storm, so it's that time of year here in the Hudson Valley. Tim, in a perfect world, on the 21st, what comes out? And is this? I think I would guess you're thinking this is the beginning of a long haul. This is a long war for making reality cool, essentially.
Well, the optimal outcome for me on the 21st is that we could come back and find, there was a consensus around 100 participants at this conference, around 14 disciplines, that we need to have a public health research agenda for managing infodemics. And there was agreement that these are the 50 top priority questions we have for us to help better understand, the infodemic. One question that, comes out of this considerations already, that we need to have studies on resilience to misinformation and how misinformation affects individuals and populations in different settings. Only if we have this kind of evidence that will guide us, to prioritize developing interventions and have investment into this area from governments and from partner donor organizations in this area on prioritizing this as an important way also for people to protect their health.
Yeah, and you mentioned investment. That's something that came up here before on this program. I had Laurie Garrett on, who's been writing about epidemics since before AIDS, and she had done a piece for The Lancet, a commentary, just describing the urgency of boosting investment in the communication capacity, the capacity to assess the internet, to track it, to do the social listening, and to do the creative campaigns around that. And setting aside the Donald Trump question, we're not going to get into politics today. This is about communication. There is a huge gap, I think. And, it's sort of easy for me to say that as a communicator. We don't invest enough in sustainability, communication, knowledge, and practice. But it still feels like a huge gap. It's such a tiny fraction of any agency's budget. And is that capacity a big part of this, the capacity gap?
I think it's a common thread to all agencies that are part of risk communication and community engagement, and I think it's due just to the fact that investors, donors, they want to have a quick bang for the buck. It means to buy something, to like a diagnostic kit, like a vaccine, something where they can report on that there was an investment and there was some credibility shown. But if you invest in communication and risk communication, it's about changing behavior. And that is much longer term. That is something not immediate you can see. Still, the impact will be immense if you can achieve behavioral change or have people really also educating other people. But that takes time, and that's not something easy to report on quickly. And I think that's the challenge. Me as part of looking this area, of course, my way needs to be in a way to build an evaluation that also presents to donors and whoever invests in this area that they can have also quick wins while investing in this. But I think that's one of the key challenges in receiving sufficient and sustainable funding for communication, for risk and community engagement.
And Claire, I think. Oh, I'm not muted. Okay. Claire, again, it's not just, it's hard to measure outcomes too. I guess the outcomes that we will see, unfortunately, are probably for the next pandemic, not this one, based on where we're at. But although we're having a session here on Friday on communication around vaccines, which is going to be a huge part of this too. How do you convince folks this is important and actionable when they'll say, well, how do we measure a change here? How do we know that there's something happening?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges we have from a research perspective is that there's no benchmarks. Even if you talk privately to the platforms to say, are you collecting benchmarks so that over the time you can check whether your interventions are making a difference? And they will kind of off the record suggest that it's very hard for them to benchmark. And this goes back to, it's very hard to define misinformation in the wild. There's a lot of things that actually are very gray. There's a lot of this that actually isn't false. It's genuine, but used out of context. It's very difficult for AI to make sense of it. But without those benchmarks, it does make it harder to have a sense of whether or not things are changing. But I'm with Tim. This is about behavioral change. I use the analogy all the time, sort of like littering or drink driving. We need to change the culture, which says it is not acceptable to publish something on your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed that is wrong, that you haven't done the checks to know that it's wrong. And we need to not just mute our uncles on WhatsApp or emails. We need to be able to say that actually this is doing harm. And I think that's what we failed to do. There's this, I think for 4 years, the conversation, particularly in the US, was disproportionately about political disinformation on Facebook. And I used to say, well, globally, the biggest problem is health and science misinformation on closed messaging apps. And I think one thing that COVID has helped us recognize in the US is that actually, health and science misinformation does real world harm. That means, people aren't vaccinated or people don't wear masks or, won't take the COVID vaccine when it comes out. So that's a good thing. But I do agree, Andy, everybody wants a quick fix to this. After 2016, there were lots of conferences about misinformation and people are like, well, surely Facebook can just tweak the algorithm. We'd say, no, we actually think this is about educating audiences and it's going to be a really slow game. But no, whatever, Claire, how do we just, get a quick response? And I think now, 4 years on to this, these conversations, there is a recognition that it's going to take maybe 30 to 50 years and maybe we will never get out of this.
Wow.
And instead, we will just have to recognize that the joys that the internet brings means that also that it has a high level of pollution. And getting back to your original question, Andy, how do we have benchmarks to say these streams of information are less polluted in 2050 than they were in 2020? But that's going to require us to have some kind of shared knowledge of, well, what do we mean when we say misinformation? How do we define that? And how can we all agree on those benchmarks?
Right. And that gets me to something I've been thinking about a lot, because this relates a lot to climate policy too. You know, everyone has, the Green New Deal had a 10-year timeline and we're going to fix the problem as opposed to build a system. And to me, when I look at the information system, it's more about building capacities, building awareness, as you were saying, you know, norms, and then letting it flow and making sure there's a lot of transparency and a lot of feedback. And again, it's hard to sort of convince someone to invest in that, where you're tuning the capacity of systems as opposed to fixing something. And Tim, I think, you know, you'll face the same pressures, I assume, at the World Health Organization. And but why are people still fighting over the vaccine 6 months from now, when this is an emergent system? The whole communication system that we're relying on now is so novel, so different than what we did. Feels like a long haul.
Well, I'm confident. You know, when I look, for example, at my mother, you know, 5 years ago, she didn't have an email address. And today she's the queen of WhatsApp in the family group.
Oh, I love it.
You know, if she can, you know, adapt, you know, these new technologies, now I think over the next 5 years, she will also adapt and learn, you know, what she can share or not. And I know I'm personally tried, you know, to, teach her, but I think it's a process. And the good thing here is, I think we're not alone here as WHO, because we have the whole UN family behind this. You know, we have UNESCO, who looks specifically at education. We have the ITU, we have UNESCO.
Right.
We have all these other organizations who also look at a specific piece of information environment, the information infrastructure, information regulation. So WHO will only look at the health aspect, but all the other aspect around, you know, misinformation and the information environment. Other UN agencies have a very important role in terms of, you know, helping us to shape this whole infrastructure and environment. And I think this is the next step we want to take after our conference, is to have a united front with our sister agencies to look at this aspect and pick up the things that were discussed in the conference that were not health related. And actually, at the conference, we have 5 other UN agencies participating and contributing to the discussion.
That's great to hear. And Claire, maybe we should talk about academia in the same way. You know, the UN has these portals and compartments. We all do. We are at Columbia. One thing I'm doing with the Earth Institute initiative is to try to build a network so that the arts are talking to the sciences, are talking to the social sciences, are talking to the engineers in ways on these systemic issues are more likely to build progress. There's a woman, Courtney Coburn, who was on this show a week ago, who's in the School of Social Work using VR to create experiences. She's Black American, and she's using these tools to broaden understanding of how race torques how we respond to questions and issues, and how health outcomes are mediated by race. I know about her through a network. You should talk to kind of very inefficient network, and how we can do that much more efficiently. I'm showing this right now, this wonderful piece of art by the New Zealand artist who worked with Susi. His Twitter handle is XTOTL. I'm blanking on his name. I think they're doing some work for WHO now. And to think that a piece of art on physical distancing that started in New Zealand could also become a worldwide phenomenon. It's been translated into many languages by volunteers, translated, gives me that same sense of excitement that Tim expressed a few minutes ago. And that was a really neat anecdote about your mother. So finding the excitement factor seems like an important part of this too. Building outcome-oriented discussions and saying, who out there can help me bake my bread? Like the famous Little Red Hen. Seems like a way maybe to catch up a little bit with that landslide. I don't know. Claire, how many newsrooms or entities are working with First Draft News? Can you just describe that a little bit more too? We want to be sure we understand how that works.
So First Draft was started about 5 years ago as a very small nonprofit. We were given some money to build a website to help journalists learn how to verify. For example, if you're trying to verify a chemical weapons attack in Syria and you only have video on YouTube from activists, how can you verify it if you have nobody on the ground? But of course, in the last 4 years, especially people have been very concerned about how do you verify information online. And we've actually worked, before this year, we almost entirely worked to do with elections, because going back to funders, that's what funders were really concerned about. So we worked in France and Nigeria and Brazil, and we built coalitions around elections. So for example, in Brazil, we were working with 32 different newsrooms, because no newsroom should be competing around verifying whether or not a meme on Twitter of Bolsonaro is true or not. So the idea is, if you can get newsrooms to collaborate, then actually they have more time and resources to spend on what journalism is really about, which is truth, not about cleaning up the dark corners of the internet. So the model was to try and be a neutral central entity to help facilitate those kind of collaborations. So we work with journalists around the world. We're currently working with a number of journalists and newsrooms in the US as we lead up to the US election, but of course we've been derailed because of COVID. But yeah, it's all about trying to upskill newsrooms so that they can develop these learnings about how, when they're on deadline, can they ensure whether or not that tweet that they want to embed into the story is actually from the person that they think it is, or is it a Russian troll? How can they verify that footage from Facebook? Is it actually from 4 years ago, but it's been given the wrong context? A lot of these skills are not taught in journalism schools. They're not necessarily natural to a newsroom, because social media is obviously relatively new. So that's the work that we do. And we also have conversations now with journalists about how to report on disinformation, because actually through debunking, you can sometimes give additional oxygen to a rumor that otherwise people hadn't heard about. So this is the challenge that newsrooms have. It used to be, well, if the more I report on it, I'm, the famous phrase, more sunlight is a disinfectant. But actually, with disinformation, bad actors are trying to manipulate newsrooms to get them to cover these rumors, because they know that by doing so, not only does it mean somebody searches on Google and they're more likely to find other conspiratorial information linked to that rumor, or simply by debunking, you're probably going to repeat the rumor in the headline. And the way that our brains work means that we're more likely to remember the rumor than we are the debunk. So there's a number of different challenges for journalists now. So we do a lot of training to say to newsrooms, okay, it's 2020, people expect you to report on this, but what are the questions that you have to ask yourselves about, should I be reporting on this? And if I'm reporting on it, how do I report it in a way that actually doesn't do more harm through my reporting? So that's the work that we do.
Just to look at this media and journalists, I think this is pivotal, as part of WHO strategy, to work very closely with science journalists at large, to really work with them, because they are an important amplifier of messaging and sharing good information. WHO is holding 3 times a week a press conference. I think we're turning now to 2 times a week. But this is a major part. That is one element where we work together with journalists and the media. But I think I want to pick up on this concept of amplification and amplifiers, because WHO, in the past, constitution, where reporting to member states, to journalist media and the scientific society. But what we're trying to change also now in this pandemic is to look at other amplification groups in societies. For example, we have a group that we call big events organizers, that the Olympic Games, the football tournaments, or other events, that we try to go into dialogue with them, for us also to listen, to understand what are their concerns, and co-create a guidance and a messaging. The same we do with big religious confession. We have a group there where all the big confessions come together, and we try to understand how do they need to tell to their constituents, to their believers, messages that will help them protect themselves. And I remember a conversation where a religious leader tells us, listen, your WHO guidance is great. It touches the mind of people, the logic, but it doesn't touch the heart. And this is what we can help you with, turning your messages in something that also touches people's heart. And this will then lead to change. And I think this is something, we have adopted in this pandemic, is really to bring in other players in society that have an important role in messaging, listen, understand, and then co-create.
The co-create part, and then test and iterate.
Yeah.
The iteration. I've seen fantastic creativity on Twitter by visualizers of climate data. There's a young UC Irvine climate scientist who just became a natural visualizer of sea ice data in the Arctic. And then someone else came up with a better way to do it. So there was almost like a competitive ecosystem pushing things in that direction. And that's, again, I was showing that piece of art earlier by X Total, I'll call him, that I think is, again, a nudge. And then someone just says, oh, well, we can do it this way. So it's a communal kind of pull toward efficacy that I think is vital. There's something I want to show you both that I learned the backstory of a couple of months after it came about. I know you probably know this. Johns Hopkins, which developed this first big dashboard for COVID-19 information. What I didn't realize until I read about it in the journal Nature was that it was two people at the Applied Engineering School, who you can see their Twitter handles here and tweets. They basically did this on overnight, the first iteration of it, when they just had the idea. And they said, boy, you know, there's a lot of, this was in January. This is right after a couple of the early tweets identifying issues in China. And now it's had billions with a B, billions of views. So that excites me too. And what I'm trying to do at Columbia is make sure that at least on our campus, there's a little bit of that ecosystem of creativity. I'd like it to be bigger than Columbia. And I think it's out there. I think what you're doing is kind of pushing in the same direction. Are there other examples that you've seen that just sort of light you up, both of you?
There.
No, I was just going to say it doesn't light me up, but my frustration, I know we're not talking about politics, but globally is seeing places where data isn't being released and that you have these collectives in Brazil and Mexico and even the US, and the fact that the best data is actually being crowdsourced, I think is a recognition of what people are prepared to do when they need to, and we're not getting the answers we need from government.
Well, yeah, I guess there's two sides to that. It reminds me, again, in the climate arena, in the Paris Agreement is largely voluntary. You know, we thought there was a mandatory way to drive climate progress. It doesn't work with 200 countries. And there's evidence that some of the nudging toward more transparency, that China being more honest about its coal use, and is because satellite imagery shows you literally there's Coal Swarm, I think, was a website that was tracking week to week. You could see the piles of coal outside individual power plants, either shrinking or growing. And we did a session here last week with live information that's so cheap and readily available that high school students in Massachusetts and Iowa were helping sort satellite imagery and identifying Amazon gold mining in the Yanomami Indian Reserve. So it's like, yeah, government's not doing it, but maybe there is almost a possibility of a post-governmental capacity to nudge the key players, corporate world, and governments ultimately, to be more honest. That's a big scale challenge. I do see lots of things pointing in that direction. It requires an open internet. It requires full access to the gifts of the internet. So, but Claire, I don't want to leave people overly optimistic either. So I'm glad you're reminding us that, you know, governments need to be grown-ups when it comes to this kind of thing too. And Tim, you know, everyone thinks the WHO is a creation, just like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It serves the nations that created it. It's not like you guys can just jump forward and do things. And that's something I think sometimes isn't understood. So what would be, you know, we have about 15 more minutes. What would be some next steps? Like, and I'm not talking on the grand scale, but like, if you could think, it's too soon to know the outcome of your meeting, Tim. 21st is coming, 16th, whatever. But can we prepare now for what to do when that happens, so we can kind of sustain and build the momentum, get the most, I think often of academia, what can we do to help at that point when that information comes out? What are some next steps we could, if we want to do another session like this in a week, what would be on the list for it?
I think we are very much at the starting point. You know, we had an earlier conference in April where we laid out a framework for managing the COVID infodemic. We came up with a list of 50 action items that different players, academia, governments, multinational organization, media, and social and companies can take on. So there's a responsibility of a whole of society responsibility to tackle this, and we propose 50 action items, you know, to manage this. And building now the science around this is just one of the action items. I think when I see down the road, I see several things, we need to be able to sustain this kind of work. I think first is, is building the science. The second item is really professionalize this. Maybe there will be an infodemiologist, like an epidemiologist in the future, or there will be certain skill sets that a risk communication person can add on to build this. Then the third element, we need to build is a common toolkit that countries can use. I think we as an international organization or academia can talk it, but as long as countries don't pick this up and see this is a problem, and we need to institutionalize somehow some of the skills, some of these tools in our response, I think that's the ultimate goal. And this is where, I hope that we can build tools and the research behind it, that people understand that there's an impact when I use it and that I can apply it in my public health response. So this is, I hope that, from today, in the next 12 to 18 months, we will get to a phase where we see, the countries, the value of managing infodemics, adding the skill set to risk communication and community engagement, and have this as part of a response to health emergencies.
Claire, is there a, you mentioned curricula, there are curricula and news literacy like Stony Brook has. I love the University of Washington, Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West's Calling Bullshit. They have a class that anyone can take online. It's an open curriculum. But again, I don't think we have at Columbia, we have a great journalism school. We have a couple of communication courses outside of that, but there isn't really a department of epidemiology of infodemiology or of communication efficacy. Stanford Internet Observatory is there. Renee DeResta will be on this show Friday at noon talking about vaccines. But is this still like a minor component of the academic landscape around these questions?
Yeah, I would say the amount of research we have on misinformation, how to talk about it, how to stop it, it's very much in its infancy. And that's why it's so exciting that WHO have brought all of these academics together. But if you just look at NIH grants, none of them have got misinformation as part of what they're studying. And so I couldn't agree with you more, of course. And, my PhD was in communication. I've always thought that it's really, really important. But, as more and more people have to talk about misinformation, when COVID started, Lysol, the people who make bleach, came out with a really sexy content portal with lovely fonts and beautiful images. And they were saying, here's all the myths about coronavirus. And they were with huge letters talking about all the myths to do with coronavirus. Now, that goes against all of our knowledge about what you should do when you're trying to debunk myths. You don't repeat the myth, you actually just repeat the fact. And so I was thinking, well, okay, we train journalists, but now I need to be training people who work at Lysol. I need to be training Andrew Cuomo's team, government officials, health authorities, journalists.
Right.
There's actually so many people now who are trying to do work to, think about misinformation and act responsibly, but it's really not taught as part of many different university curricula or in professional development. It's just not something that we've ever taken seriously. And I would say now we're at a point where we have to think very strategically about how do we take public information officers and give them courses in exactly the kind of things that we're talking about. So there's that part. And then I would say very quickly, we've actually tomorrow are launching a new text-based course. So in an era of everybody's exhausted by Zoom, we can't really do face-to-face training. We've come up with a 14-day course that you say, I would like to get my alert at 11 o'clock every morning. And every day you get a little text alert. Who knows? We need to evaluate to see whether it does something. But it's actually very much focused on inoculation theory and how can we teach people about the tactics and techniques they will see, as opposed to here's how you check something after you see it. And that's what we're trying to test, which is, there has been academic research that shows inoculation theory works. Does it work in the form of a text message course? We don't know. But I'm a big proponent. I'm an academic who gets frustrated that so much excellent academic work is locked in journals in different disciplines that people can't find. When you get there, it's hard to read and it's 3 years out of date. And right now, in the middle of this, infodemic, we should have much quicker peer-reviewed data that's written in a way that's really accessible. And a couple of years ago, I was a fellow at Harvard, and we helped create the Harvard Misinformation Review, which does exactly that, which is most articles no longer than 3,000 words, very nicely designed and peer reviewed in 15 days. Like how can we start thinking about that? Because we need to be iterating, we need to be throwing spaghetti at the wall and be like, that fell off, but that seems pretty sticky. And how can we make sure that we're not waiting 3 years to then iterate on the basis of that slightly sticky spaghetti?
Is that still up and running, the Harvard Misinformation Review?
It is. It's I don't know if I'm allowed to put in links, but yes, if you Google it, it's the Harvard Misinformation Review, and it's really excellent.
Oh, sure.
It's really excellent, and we also have John Donovan from this group also on our conference. So it's exciting to hear that.
Joan did an interview with the guy I'm showing this the Twitter feed of Steakum, which is a Pennsylvania-based like meat company, and they were doing some pretty amazing Twitter flow around, as he said here, friendly reminder in times of uncertainty and misinformation, anecdotes are not data. Good data is carefully measured and collected information, et cetera, et cetera. He was becoming kind of a pioneer and a loud voice and gaining a lot of followers for being constructively engaged in this. Maybe that's part of that, what Claire was just saying about observing when things are right, saying, oh, that's something we need to pay attention to, whether it's coming from academia or, in this case, an informal communicator. Now, it's such a landscape. It's a landscape where there's so much emerging so often at such frequency that we're still buffeted. There's just that overload part of the infodemic as well. And actually, maybe that's a good place to start to zoom in on toward the end. Personal practices. You mentioned your mom, Tim. What is she feeling? Where in the world is she? What does she think about the information buffeting we're all facing? And I'm going to ask Claire about some of these practices you could have as a person going forward.
I think most of her information comes eventually from family and the close friends she's with. You understand, we are refugees, we are migrants. So her command of the local language where we live in is not as perfect to understand and follow all the media news. So media news is not the primary source of her information. It's really what families tell her on Facebook, on WhatsApp group. And this is, of course, she has a son working in the World Health Organization, so I can intervene. And she's happy then, because then she can share the good information, and she's then very proud. And I think this is where I start my motivation from. I think majority of people are good-minded. They want to be in the spotlight. They want to be recognized as somebody who has good information and share them. They just need to learn, where to find it, to recognize the bad information, and then, become good actors. And if I can do that with my mom, I think we can do it with many more people out there.
Let's hope so. And Claire, what are, I know you had them in your slides, and I'll post links at the end where people can find more, but 2 or 3 things that are that kind of practice. One of them that I used to teach at Pace University, I taught a course called Blogging a Better Planet. For 6 years, I built this course, and the students had to do what I call a backtrack journal. They had to take one thing a week where they set that across their screen and just do a provenance thing. Where did this come from? How did it get to me? How many stops did it take along the chain from some creator like that New Zealand artist to my screen? And I don't know if you have your own sense of things that are like that, practices that can help us navigate this storm.
Yeah, and I mean, I often get asked by journalists or others for kind of tips for people, how do you know what's a trustworthy news outlet? And the truth is right now that there are so many different news outlets. And I thought, Tim, that's a great point. For many communities, they look to their community media. In a country like the UK, where we have strong public service media and we have regulated television, it's easier to say, this is more trustworthy. But it's really hard. So I increasingly say, one of the joys of the internet is that you really can understand how different outlets take one story and cover it differently. And I think that's part of understanding how information is formed. And, one thing I say about the internet is, when I was growing up, my parents got one newspaper and we used to read that newspaper cover to cover. Was that better than the situation now? And so I often say, it's not new and sexy, but Google News is, I think, a good place to, if you hear something on like Facebook, go to Google News and see all the different outlets that are talking about that, see the different ways it's being framed. And I think that reading across is something that it helps people say this. I can't tell you that this newspaper is always going to be right, or this TV channel is always going to be right, because they're all different around different stories. But understanding that there is a news diet, and also recognizing that when you consume media that agrees with your position, how you feel when you read it versus when you read something from an outlet that does not necessarily support your position, and feel yourself have a different reaction, but recognize that both of those outlets are covering the same story. And I think that's, you can do that with students, but I think it's also something for all of us to be reminded of. Information is not neutral, and the stories that we decide to cover or not cover is a decision itself, let alone how we cover it. So,
and I wanted to touch back on something you mentioned in your talk and just briefly today, the don't mute your uncle and don't mock your uncle. We're surrounded by variegated reactions to information. So it's not just social listening, it's our personal listening too, right?
Yeah.
How important is that?
Yeah. And I mean, really would say that, we should have conflict resolution experts in these conversations, because in many countries, the way that certain issues have become polarized means we don't want to have difficult conversations with each other. So we're avoiding each other. And that actually is not good for society. And so, I have this kind of talk that I give about how to talk to Uncle Bob, which is one thing we haven't really stressed here, is that the information that we decide to share on social media is a form of performance, because it's tied to our identity. Right. You want to share information that is kind of saying to your followers, this is what I believe around a particular candidate, or around vaccines, or around climate. You want to think like, what would my friends at the school gate think of me when I share this information? So when you call out your uncle or your high school friend and say you're wrong, you're basically connected, like that's connected to their identity. So you are publicly shaming them around something that they would rather not be called out on. And so it means that they double down on their views. So instead we should be using empathetic language that says, I saw you shared that. It's so interesting. I've seen a number of people share that, but actually I've been digging into it and I want answers to this stuff too. But I actually think that this is being shared to divide our neighborhood or our community or our family. And like, I'd love to talk to you more about this, because I think it's having harm and I don't know how we can get out of this. But that kind of language is that you're talking to your uncle as a way to say, this is about us and we, and as opposed to I'm right, you're wrong, or, I'm the journalist, I've got all the answers, what do you know? And I actually think we need language that should come from conflict resolution to say, how can we be empathetic with each other? Because it doesn't help when we've been weaponized actually to argue with each other about information, and the bad actors are sitting back being like, yep, that's what I wanted to happen. Exactly. And we're the ones that are being used and manipulated.
At Columbia, one of the most exciting discoveries I made was there is a difficult conversations laboratory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's run by Peter Coleman, who's also running around the world this year on sabbatical studying what he calls sustainable peace. There are places in the world that should be in conflict but are peaceful. And he's looking at the dynamics there. And so much of this is about interpersonal relationships and norms. So these skill sets are out there. But as we talk, we discover them.
We need to bring them together.
Oh yeah. And I couldn't agree more on that one. When I heard about this, my whole head lit up. I was like, oh my God, this is before COVID-19. I was just thinking in the context of climate debates, and it's a practice. It's just like I was saying about Helen Ingram, the social scientist, before I spoke to her. My practice of journalism would have been to just keep churning out prize-winning stories about climate change and going to the North Pole. And the reason I'm not doing as much of that is I intersected with a body of information that was difficult to accept at first, but then it buffeted me until it won me over. So I think that's a key part of this going forward. So Tim, I'm going to give you the last word. This has been a wonderful, fitting into an hour. These questions is really just scraping the surface. You're doing, I think, great work there. So maybe if you have a final thought about what people can do, what resources are out there, that'd be great to Tim, you have the floor for the closing thoughts here. I will open the page to your website too.
Oh, thanks a lot. I think, my key advice, and I realize it myself, is, consume less during the day. I think in the beginning we were all excited and checking every 30 minutes what's happening out there. But actually, at the end of the day, consume less. And I think that's also helps you to be more protected from the infodemic.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, Jeff Schlegelmelch, who has a hard name to pronounce, but who's an amazing expert in this. He's the new director of our National Center for Disaster Preparedness. And he said this is true even of practitioners. This quote, and another one I'll show you, resonate with me so much. This is from Jeff, who's the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia. I've actually observed over the years, whether it's in agencies or emergency operations centers, that when we're dealing with uncertainty, rather than pivot ourselves to manage within uncertainty, we try to cram more and more information into our brains, trying to connect the dots, but the information is just more noise. That was on this show recently. And he said this one thing that he posted on Facebook for his relatives and friends, which is probably a good way to close this too. He said, a quick word of advice to folks out there struggling to keep up with the latest COVID-19 info. Don't try and keep up, right? There's a lot of real-time, raw information coming out. And as we know, we've been saying, these platforms are designed to addict you to that scroll. He said the fire hose is not actionable and may even be dangerous. If it becomes worth listening to, the CDC, or in this case, the WHO and local officials, will update their guidelines. Take some time daily to review the latest information from official sources who will update on what the science tells us. That should be more than enough to keep you up to date. We're all dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Adding more noise won't do anything but boost your anxiety. Use your best judgment with the information available, and for the space in between, find ways to relax, recharge, and if you are able, help others who may be in need. And I think that the part of the infodemic I think we don't pay enough attention to is just the overdose part. The disinformation is there. It's awful. It's dangerous. But the overdose is there too, and it is awful and dangerous. So this, I hope, was useful information in this 1 hour here for everyone who tuned in. As soon as we're offline, people can share the links they've been watching on. Thank you so much, Claire Wardle from the First Draft News, and Tim Nguyen from the World Health Organization for being part of this conversation on Sustain What. I'm going to end with a little boilerplate. Sustain What is it's a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration, and now this great pause that COVID-19 has enforced upon us. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. Although I'll tell you, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the path it took from China throughout the world was pretty fast too. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. As I said, as soon as we're done, share the link you've been watching on with friends and circles far and wide. You heard some great insights here today, and there's lots more information I can post and get to you in other ways. Keep in touch with ideas. Look at the scrolling bar at the bottom. When this is done, go back and find my email address, suggest follow-up sessions, and stay safe and honor those who are in harm's way more than those of us who have the capacity to do our work at home. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.